everyone. Thanks for joining us. We're continuing our series on truth and reconciliation, and this morning we are talking about Indigenous justice issues and how we can space of reconciliation there, or as our friends in Yakima describe it, they are doing efforts for conciliation, because there was never a time when we were together and broke a relationship. We are just trying to come together for the first time. I think Kelly shared that with you all in the first class. So my first questions for you, I'd like to get a little bit of discussion and hear from you before we jump into the wealth of handouts that I've forced you to take. I'm curious. I have 3 questions for you. What were you taught growing up about Native Americans and the relationship between our government and our history and Native peoples? What were you not taught? And what questions do you have? Yeah, go ahead.
I grew up in Rochester, New York, or a suburb of Rochester, New York. I lived on Landing.
That's good.
Landing. And Landing Road was a road that was created from the Iroquois Nation and how they portaged their canoes from Lake Ontario to the Genesee River. So I grew, our museum had big dioramas of the long houses that the Seneca Nation lived in. And I remember making one. I mean, it was a church, it was a school project. I copied my sister, who was 5 years older, and she'd put a little red Christmas light at the end in what was the fire, and it was a big hit. So I did the same thing. So, you know, we grew up learning a lot about the Iroquois Nation people. We knew nobody who was connected with them. But it's a big piece of upstate New York's history.
Did that not come along with like the relationship between colonists and Native Americans? It was just, here's what they were like, and that's it.
No, it was very honoring of the Native people, but nothing about how they were treated when white people came.
Nada.
So growing up, I think many people probably had my experiences. There was this division. So first of all, when you played Cowboys and Indians, raise your hand here if you ever played Cowboys and Indians. Nobody wanted to be the Indian. There was always the fight, you know, no one wanted to be the Indian. And so you had that growing up with the feeling that this is a defeated people, that we won, basically. But the other thing, a couple other things is, of course, my grandfather was a Presbyterian minister, and they lived in Oklahoma. And so my grandmother was adamant that the Native peoples had been treated badly, specifically the Trail of Tears. And so I also heard that story. And then the third, and again, there were no Native peoples left in our area. In fact, the remnants of tribes in our area are not getting national recognition. But when farmers were plowing their fields, they would come up with skulls and graveyards. So just a real mixed bag. But again, I don't think I ever met anyone until I was in college who was Native.
Yeah, I wasn't taught anything. I'll always remember the Pilgrim story where, you know, the Indians helped them, which not true, but you know, that's the only story I can remember about the Indians is that. And then, you know, later on as I grew up, I learned a lot more, but I never learned it as a kid. The only thing I remember is the Lone Ranger. And Tonto, they were friends, right? So I was like, okay, that's a good thing, right? But if you watched all the Westerns and stuff, the Indians are always the bad guys, right? So.
Yeah, when I was growing up, they didn't have anything in the schools at all. Oh, SK, you wanna go next, SK?
Sure would, because as many of you know, my dad was a Yakima Indian Nation member. And his original tribe was Modoc in Oklahoma. So my brother and I are now officially enrolled members of the Modoc Nation because of the lineage of my great grandmother being an Indian slave. So it's very interesting, and my father was very open about the Indian culture, and he always used to chuckle at all the stereotypes. It never bothered him. And when we played cowboys and Indians in my neighborhood, my brother and I always took the Indian role because we were going to win. So yeah, so it's kind of a different perspective. And my dad was always very open about our family heritage on his side, because it's really a Scottish Native American heritage down through the line. And we knew where we came from, and we knew a lot of the cultural philosophy. My dad, as a Presbyterian, he grew up Presbyterian as well. We also followed the Native American philosophy of the Red Road ethics, of living a righteous life. And we were well versed in their form of the 10 Commandments, with much more emphasis on creation and nature and taking care of that. And in fact, one of my Bibles is the complete New Testament in First Nations version. And it's very insightful, being written by that culture. And, I read things about how mistreated, and of course, as we now know, the residential school issues and all, every child matters. And I've been involved in the missing and murdered Indigenous women and children efforts through the years. So for me, there are very few questions about what happened and why it happened. My questions are always, what the heck are we going to do about it going forward? How do you create a culture of forgiveness in that reconciliation? How do we embrace that particular culture? So kind of that's my stand.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I don't think anybody's gonna talk after SK.
You've been the only one patiently raising your hand, and you haven't got a chance to speak yet.
Well, it goes back to the stereotypes. I wasn't taught anything about from a Native American perspective. Of course, none of us were, but we had a family story, which was that one of my ancestors and her brother, when they were children, were kidnapped by the Indians. And this was in Pennsylvania, and taken by them across Pennsylvania and all the way to Fort Detroit. This was during the French and Indian War, and the French had offered the local Native Americans, because they were fighting the British, if the Indians would go and attack the British and get a scalp for each, they'd get money for each adult scalp and each live child. So they killed all the family, got their scalps, and took these 2 children to Detroit. And it was kind of a family story about, kind of an adventure story by the time it got down to us, that this little girl went off with her brother, went off with the Indians. And eventually, when the war ended, got to go home, although there wasn't anybody left at home. I don't know what happened after that.
That's really interesting to hear that it was the British who were paying them.
No, the French.
French were paying them to take British.
Yeah, the French were paying them to scalp them.
Yeah.
I don't know if it was their idea to scalp people, but the French
We're
were paying them for each British scalp they could bring them.
When the stereotype was that the Europeans were civilized, and it was
Right, exactly. So, and they were uncivilized by scalping, but it was actually, they were being paid by the French.
Well, yeah, they were being paid.
I remember reading that scalping started with the whites. That was That was not started by Native
I
Americans.
have not heard that before, and I'm shocked and not surprised.
Yeah, it is in a.
Yeah.
Supposedly civilized
Mhm.
Europeans.
My favorite movie growing up was Pocahontas, and I know we're not supposed to be excited about that anymore, but I think more of my, I also wanted to be the Indians when we played, Cowboys and Indians. I had more of the idealized image, in my mind that was one of the stereotypes that we get from literature and movies. But I'm really interested, SK, that you brought up the concept of natives being enslaved. That one of the video that I just had not to show today was like, I came across a video called the Slavery of Our Ancestors. It's like a 12-minute documentary about how the first slaves in America were all native peoples. And if the colonists had not enslaved native peoples and started to run out of their supply, would they have ended up looking somewhere else and starting to import Africans to meet that supply or not? So it seems like a piece of history that we don't hear, and some of the intersectionality there that we don't pay any attention to.
Yeah. And you need to understand too that Indians were slaves to Indians of other tribes. My great-great-grandmother from the Modoc tribe was she and her sister were taken as slaves to the Klamath Falls, Oregon area, and eventually that was migrated up to Yakima Reservation. But she was a slave to another Indian tribe. I mean, when they had their own wars between them, they took that, but she was treated very well. In all the interviews with the Bureau of Indian Affairs, she was treated very well, like family, but she was a slave and she had things to do, but she was not mistreated. And I think that's kind of an interesting spin on what we usually think slavery is, you know? Yeah, so that was very comforting when I heard that from my dad, and I read the interviews, and I have massive amounts of paperwork of interviews, and it's just amazing from the 20s and 30s and 40s and 50s. You know, it's a wealth of information. So it's really kind of interesting for me to do that. Plus, my dad really felt that he wanted to also help archive a lot of culture. So he amassed a huge collection of Indian artifacts and things like that, some of which were sold to private collectors, but most of which I retain in inheritance. So I have these really precious things that belong to a culture that I have a connection with. So it's quite interesting.
Yes. Thank you, SK.
So as we're thinking about the themes of truth and reconciliation, I'm curious from your conversation so far, what do you think are the first steps in seeking after truth and reconciliation?
Or conciliation.
Well, telling all the stories, I
Yeah.
mean, telling the stories,
Yeah.
you know,
Getting what the stories really were.
Listening.
the real stories.
The real stories,
Yeah.
the truth.
Listening.
Listening to
Yeah.
their stories and not just
Yeah.
telling our stories.
No, I meant.
Yeah.
telling, but
Yeah.
Or SK stories.
Yeah.
Being native.
So listening and learning, maybe building relationships, so there is someone we can listen to and learn from. Paying attention to things that we have to do some work to pay attention to, because it's not going to be part of the dominant culture that is trying to get our attention, right? We have to do a little bit of digging, a little bit of work.
How did that work with the youth in Yakima?
How did it work?
I mean, what's your impression of it? Tell us what happened.
Yeah, I thought it was wonderful because we established relationships first, and so there was so much fun and joking around and doing work together. And they started off by saying, we're gonna learn some difficult things this week. You're gonna hear some things that probably make you uncomfortable, that make you sad. Our goal is not that you feel guilty. We think guilt is not a useful emotion. We think feeling guilt is a way to sort of self-flagellate without doing anything. So you feel like, oh, I feel guilty. This is enough. So if we're not interested in your guilt, we're interested in figuring out how to take some responsibility and what is our responsibility moving forward. So like you said, where we go from here, SK is what they were interested in. And they were very gracious. You know, even when they were teaching serious things, they were teaching it lightly and joking with us. It was really, really lovely. And every time we took a break from work, they said, every time we have a water break or we have lunch, we're gonna tell you a story. And most of our stories are not written down because that's not how we do things. And that, you know, gave us the sense we are from a written culture, right? You can find anything on the internet, you can find anything from research. You don't need to be in relationship to learn things. But here you had to be in relationship if you wanted to find out who they were, what they valued, how they lived, what their stories are. And as someone who does a lot of research, it can be frustrating that I can't just like go to the archives and learn all of their stories. I have to sit and work and laugh and joke and eat with them if I want to find out the stories that they live by, which was a lovely thing to discover because that is not the way that we do things. So some of the things that I'm sharing today are going to be coming directly out of the things that they taught us there. One of the most impactful experience was they took us to a Fort Simcoe that began as a military fort during the Indian Yakima War, and then was transferred into a boarding school. And you know, we're sitting there in the sun, it's 108 degrees. And they're telling us stories, like my grandparents went here. And they made us all stand in a shed that was probably about this tall and packed us in there, and it was very hot. And they said this is where they would put children when they spoke their native languages as a punishment. But they didn't speak English, so they didn't know why they were being punished. They were just made to stand in here all day with no food, and they would pack 60, 70 people in this shed. And so they asked us, you know, what that made us think of, and we were all like, the only time we've heard of anything like this is studying Holocaust and the ways that people were packed into the trains. This feels like an experience of the Holocaust, and you know, being reminded that Hitler studied American treatment of the natives in order to create his plans for the Holocaust, which is, that's sobering, right? We look at the Holocaust and we're like, oh, that was terrible and over there. And thank goodness we're not like them.
He also studied our laws on race.
Yeah.
In the South.
Yeah. Sobering, isn't it? So one of the things that I was hearing when we're all sharing the things that we grew up thinking about, hearing about Native Americans, one of the things that I grew up with is this assumption that even if this is terrible, even if we heard the things that were terrible, this happened a long time ago and there aren't any left. Which is not true and not helpful.
Got SK right there.
Right, right. In the movie that I was telling you about, the documentary, there was a girl who said, I was sitting in a class when they told me there's none left, and she's like, I'm right here. I'm right here. As a child. One of the woman who led the program at Bending Wing, she'll be with us in November. Her mom was taken in the 70s and sent to a boarding school in Oklahoma, which was just wild to hear that in the 70s that happened, that her mom was taken. And you know, they take them far enough away that they can't just leave and get home on their own, so that's why they do the displacement. And then her mom came back and was never the same, and later died of an overdose. Some people who we were talking to there had lost a family member each week for the past month, mostly to drugs and alcohol, which was just awful to hear, like that to see and witness the ramifications of this history now. But let's go a little bit further back. One of your handouts, the one that is not stapled. Please. This is a handout on the Doctrine of Discovery. Raise your hand if you've heard of the Doctrine of Discovery before. Okay, a few, yeah. This was the doctrine that was sanctioned in 1493 by the Pope, by an edict, allowing that any land that is owned or used or occupied by people who are not Christian is yours for the taking, because this will encourage the spread of the gospel. So
Any land that is discovered by a European for the first time.
yes, if the people who are occupying the land are not Christians, they're allowed to take it, or if it is not occupied by any other Christian nation in Europe, any other Christian king or queen, I think it says. It is yours for the taking and enjoy. And no one can ever make you give this back. So, would somebody like to read for us? We have a little bit more description of the Doctrine of Discovery. And then it's going to mention two names, Sepulveda and Las Casas. These are two people. This was one of the most interesting things that I learned in grad school history. So this is not something that I heard of until grad school history class. That Sepulveda and Las Casas were two people who were debating on whether or not it was right and ethical and theologically faithful to be taking over the land of the natives and to be treating them in terrible ways and enslaving them. So they actually paused colonization for a year to have this discussion in the courts of Spain. Which I think is really interesting because
Somebody had a moral conscience somewhere.
I think one of the easiest things to do when you're looking at history was say like, well, they didn't know any better. This is just the information that they had available to them. And this was just the cultural norm. And it would have been really hard to go against that. And then seeing that they had a chance, they had an alternative, and they chose not to take it. So that's what's happening when it mentioned Sepulveda and Las Casas. And then we have excerpts from the Papal Bull that Pope Alexander VI wrote.
SK had a question.
I'm sorry.
Could you send me the PDFs of these and I will send it to the folks online?
Yes, I will. Sorry, I didn't do that ahead of time. Yeah.
Well, you don't know who's gonna be here.
That's true. So would somebody like to read those first few paragraphs on the Doctrine of Discovery?
I'll go ahead,
Thanks, Liz.
starting with 1493.
Yeah.
Okay. The 1493 aimed to justify.
What was the time? Document of Discovery?
Doctrine of Discovery, and now Lois is gonna read it.
What was the time frame?
Written in 1493.
So while I'm talking, raise your hand if you can't hear me and I'll start shouting, okay? In 1493, papal decree aimed to justify Christian European explorers' claims on land and waterways they allegedly discovered and promote Christian domination and superiority, and has been applied in Africa, Asia, Australia, New Zealand, and the Americas. If an explorer proclaims to have discovered the land in the name of a Christian European monarch, plants a flag on its soil, and reports his, quote, discovery to the European rulers and returns to occupy it, the land is now his, even if someone else was there first. Should the original occupants insist on claiming that the land is theirs, the, in quotes, discoverer can label the occupant's way of being on the land inadequate according to European standards. This ideology supported the dehumanization of those living on the land and their dispossession, murder, and forced assimilation. The doctrine fueled white supremacy insofar as white European settlers claimed they were instruments of divine design and possessed cultural superiority. I'm sorry.
Sepulveda, yeah.
Sepulveda argued against Las Casas on behalf of the colonists' property rights. Sepulveda rationalized Spanish treatment of the American Indians by arguing that Indians were, quote, natural slaves, end quote, and that Spanish presence in the New World would benefit them. Citing the Bible and canon law, Las Casas responded, quote, all the world is sorry, I'm getting teary-eyed, all the world is human. He contradicted Sepulveda's assertions that Indians were barbarous, and that they committed crimes against natural law, and that they oppressed and killed innocent people, and that war should be waged against infidels. Las Casas managed to convince the theologians and Valladolid, that sounds right, that the Spanish policy was unjust and had to change. However, his victory had no impact on the colonists, who continued to enslave American Indians. Las Casas has been called the, quote, father of anti-imperialism and anti-racism, end quote. He greatly influenced the drive to abolish the Spanish Emosiendo system. The system of land ownership and forced labor gave Spanish colonists the right to enslave Indians and take their lands.
Thanks for reading that. Sorry about that.
Where did this come from? Who wrote it?
It might have been Wikipedia. Yeah, thanks for asking.
Sorry, I'm a journalist.
I think it might be from, a book called The Other Slavery. I think there's more to the title than that. I just can't recall what it is. It's very reminiscent of what's in that book anyways.
Yeah, I think it was a webpage that just had a description of the Doctrines of Discovery.
The webpage.
The webpage, yeah, I know, that one.
Google.
Good source. You got me. I thought about that yesterday, so I should put the source on there, because I already couldn't. So that is very sobering to hear, isn't it? I have included a segment of Inter Caetera, the papal bull that sanctioned the Doctrine of Discovery, and I'm just going to read the highlighted portion that is on the bottom of the page and goes down to the next one. It's difficult to read because each paragraph is its own sentence, even that last one. So there's a lot of clauses, a lot of commas. So that all islands and mainlands discovered and to be discovered, detected and to be detected, from said line towards the west and south, as long as they were not in fact in the possession of another Christian king or prince up to the day of the nativity of our Lord Jesus Christ, that just passed, and from where begins our current 1493rd year, when some of the aforementioned islands were found by your envoys and captains, and which the authority of the Almighty God bestowed on us in our succession of St. Peter and the vicariate of Jesus Christ, that we execute on earth and with the consent of the people present, we give, grant, and assign in perpetuity to you and to your heirs and successors, the kings of Castile and Leon, and all the islands and mainlands found and to be found, discovered and yet to be discovered, in the west and south, with all their dominions, cities, castles, towns, and villages, and all rights, jurisdictions, and domains, and make, appoint, and regard you and said heirs and successors as their lords, with full, free, and all-encompassing power, authority, and jurisdiction. We decree likewise that no right of any Christian prince, who in fact owns said islands or mainlands by the said day of the nativity of our Lord Jesus Christ, can be challenged or invalidated by this gift, grant, and assignment of ours.
Talk about entitled. Some old guy in Rome can decide who owns this land.
And I'm realizing I don't have a date for the cruelties of the Spaniards by Las Casas. I assume it's somewhere in the 1500s, similar to Sepulveda's. But there is a 45-page description by Las Casas that goes island by island and territory by territory of the ways that he has seen Spanish people treat the natives there.
Wow. So he went to the New World.
He was there. Yeah, he was I believe he was a priest.
A good
Was
priest.
there to be a missionary. and witnessed all of these things and came back and said, they are lying to you, they are not furthering the name of God, this is the treatment they're doing. Some of it was like, we're walking up to a person and telling them to believe in God, and if they say no, they don't speak my language at all, but this is just like, this is me doing what's right, Do you believe in God? No? Okay, I'm allowed to kill you now. Or you don't say anything, or you don't know how to say anything, or like, now I have the right to cut off your hands, was one of the things.
So Las Casas, was he able to persuade it? At least like he was able to persuade.
I think in the court, yeah, they were like,
It said
good
victory.
job. Yes,
You
but
won in court.
it changed nothing.
But the colonies were too far away.
Yes. Yeah.
And the Pope obviously didn't believe him either, because the same year the Pope had this bull. So,
Yeah, so I included one of the more graphic paragraphs and then his final conclusion. So I'm gonna read that, and I apologize in advance. I also affirm that I saw with these eyes of mine the Spaniards for no other reason but only to gratify their bloody mindedness, cut off hands, noses, and ears, both of Indians and Indianesses, and that in so many places and parts that it would be too prolix and tedious to relate them all. Nay, I have seen the Spaniards let loose their dogs upon the Indians to bait and tear them in pieces, and such a number of villages burnt by them as cannot well be discovered. Father, this is a certain truth, that they snatched babes from the mother's embraces, and taking hold of their arms, threw them away as far as they would from them. A pretty kind of bar tossing recreation. They committed many other cruelties which shook me with terror at the very sight of them, and would take up too much time in the relation. This deep, bloody American tragedy is now concluded, and my pen choked up with Indian blood and gore. I have no more to say, but pronounce the epilogue made by the author, and leave the reader to judge whether it deserves a platitude. The Spaniards first set sail to America, not for the honor of God, or as persons moved and merited thereunto by fervent zeal to the true faith, nor to promote the salvation of their neighbors, nor to serve the king as they falsely boast and pretend to do, but in truth only stimulated and goaded on by insatiable avarice and ambition, that they might forever domineer, command, and tyrannize over the West Indians, those whose kingdoms they hope to divide and distribute among themselves, which, to deal candidly and no more or less intentionally than by all these indirect ways, to disappoint and expel the kings of Castile out of those dominions and territories, that they themselves, having usurped the supreme and regal empire, might first challenge it as their right, and then possess and enjoy it. Strong language, huh? What do you hear him doing there?
having a moral conscience in the 15th century.
Yeah, I was gonna say that they weren't doing anything, it had nothing to do with God, what they were doing.
Yeah. He's talking to the king and saying, they're also not doing it for you, and they're eventually gonna take it away from you.
Mhm.
Yeah, which is what they did.
Yeah.
But I find this very comforting, because we tend to say, oh, we are modern and we have all of these new ideas about equality and justice. But really, the fight has been going on forever with really good people trying to do the right thing. And since they didn't win often, they didn't write the history books. Right. So I think one cool thing is to go back in history and say, who else was fighting the good fight? And who else was silenced?
The voices that we don't hear about until grad school.
Yeah. Right.
If you take the class.
If you take the class, yeah. It was a survey class I had to.
Well, it was the good thing you did.
Yeah, it was, even though it was 3 hours long on a Monday night.
It's one class.
I read a little bit more of Las Casas too, and I was doing some research, and it was interesting and not surprising to find that even Las Casas had a lot of language of infantilizing the native people and saying they're like children.
So they're innocents. You shouldn't do this to innocents.
Yeah, they are innocent, they are weak, and they are unintelligent.
Mhm.
So like, yeah, they're not civilized, but it's not their fault. Um. So still quite a bit of that superiority. But even so, trying to use what he knew to do the right things. And then we have from Subtle Beta explaining that they are dim-witted and mentally lazy, although they may be physically strong enough to fulfill all the necessary tasks. They say it's sanctioned by divine law itself, for it is written in the book of Proverbs, he who is stupid will serve the wise man. And so it is with the barbarous and inhumane people who have no civil life and peaceful customs. It will always be just and in conformity with natural law that such people submit to the rule of more cultured and humane princes and nations. And if they reject us, we can go to war with them, and such a war will be just according to natural law. I think one of his most convincing, or what he thinks is one of his most convincing arguments is, they practice human sacrifice. So if we enslave and kill them, we're saving people from being sacrificed by their own. And I think, you know,
We can justify it.
yeah, we'll play on that fear, like they are cannibals and they are sacrificing humans. Okay, so we can do whatever we want. So that's some of the history and background there, the Doctrine of Discovery that has, I think, undergirded a significant amount of the culture that we've inherited. And as we mentioned, the slavery of Indians and the encomienda system was a system of creating large plantations of slaves in the Indies and in South and Central America. There was quite a bit done to distinguish race at that point as they're trying to justify their actions. And so it's interesting to think how race was beginning to be constructed in regards to Europeans versus Native Americans rather than whites versus blacks. And then bringing folks from Africa just continued the system of slavery and continued the drive to justify it racially. Yeah. So quite a few of the books that I was looking into that try to give a chronology or a genealogy of racism and a construction of race begin with Europeans versus Native Americans. So I'm looking at the time, wondering how much I can still fit in.
May I show you something I brought?
Yes, please.
Are you aware of the public declarations that all of the leaders of the Christian churches in the Northwest made to the Native Americans 3 different times?
No, I know.
87, 97, and 2014.
Wow, thank you.
And it was in the form of an apology for the use of the lands and the mistreatment of the people.
And what denominations came together to do this?
Well, you see at the bottom of the page who signed. And
Roman Catholic, Presbyterian, Lutheran.
yeah, and
I'm excited to read this. Thank you.
it's very sadly it's you know, you don't see it very publicized in the news or anything else that this has occurred and that the churches have tried to pull together and to acknowledge that the lands have been taken from them. Mainly that was what it was about. And then there was an event that I attended, and I don't know when, I was might have been 87 or 97, I couldn't tell you. Held at the Daybreak Star Center, which is the Native American place in Seattle.
Is that the one in Discovery Park?
Yes, and where a representative of every tribe was invited to come. And in the ceremony, they were given a beautiful blanket. And the name of their tribe was announced and all. It was a long ceremony with drumming and everything, and I think it was the church council that did that. I don't recall for sure, but I think that's who initiated that process.
Thank you. I'm excited to look more into this. One of the things that I brought for us today is a call to action by the PCUSA from 2020. But before we take a look into that, I wanted to go a little bit into the local Yakima history that we learned on our trip. And I'm not sure if this is something that you've all been familiar with. I think you probably all lived here longer than I have. So maybe. Have you all heard of the Yakima Indian War? So yes, good. So it's me being excited that you don't all already.
In all my life, and I didn't know
Yes.
about it.
Yes, the Yakima Indian War. I'm sorry, I don't have the date written down. But I have some maps to pass out, just two of them to take a look at. There's a big chunk in the middle. It's sort of hard to read the words. I blew it up as much as I could. But there's this off-white sort of peachish territory in the middle of the state, which was the original land that was supposed to be allotted to the Yakima tribe when they signed the original treaty between the Yakima Nation and the United States government. And this tan part right here is what land they ended up getting to keep. So the chiefs were reluctant to sign the treaty in the first place. The treaty was supposed to give them 2 years to move on to the land that they were going to be allotted. It was going to include protection of their land from the US military, keeping other people off of it. It was going to include fishing and hunting rights to other land as well. But they were given 2 years to move, and then within 2 weeks of that time, white settlers started moving into their land, and they were forced off of it. So that was the first breaking of the treaty. Pretty soon after that, a group of coal miners came right through the middle of the territory and came across a village where the men were out hunting and raped and murdered the children and women and left them all for dead and continued on their way. Men came back from hunting, discovered what had happened, chased down this wagon trail, killed all of the coal miners for what they had done. And then the US government said, you broke the treaty, we no longer owe you anything. You killed coal miners. So we are reducing the amount of land we've given you. Here's your new reservation. We no longer are required to protect you, which we didn't do in the first place. And we're no longer going to provide for you the kind of food and supplements that we originally said that we would, because you broke the treaty. So here's this map to show what their land was originally according to the treaty and then what it became.
Pretty typical, isn't it? Well, when we were traveling national parks, like in New Mexico and places like that, they told the history of how many times they broke treaties with the Indians in those areas. And, and they were trying to, stay out of the way of everything, but like you said, they just never honored anything that they did. So I think the national parks have done a great job of doing the educational history when we were doing it.
That's a good place to start. I remember I spent quite a bit of time in Yosemite during college and hearing the native stories about how the land around there formed. So, yeah.
Would this have been in the 19th century?
I think the date is on there, but I might need to really squint to read it.
I can't see.
It got pretty big. Yeah.
Can you tell us about this call to action?
Yes, I can. Oh, real quick, I wanted to mention that there are still legal battles going on constantly that are trying to take more and more land away from the tribes, away from the Yakima tribes specifically. However, recently they were just given back a portion of Mount Adams. That is one of their really sacred sites, and they call it Mount Pato. And a lot of the stories we heard when we were there were about the creation of Pato. And I think Pato means the one who greets the morning first, because of the three mountains there, they're all supposedly sisters. And Mount Pato is the one that's furthest east. So she is the one who greets the morning first. And that was a victory that they were excited to share with us, that I think 1/3 of Mount Pato now belongs back to the Yakima.
Yeah, because when you drive down, you're coming from here and you're driving down into Yakima, you can see Mount Adams and sometimes not.
Yeah, sometimes all three of them. So now we have the Presbyterian, the PCUSA call to action that was put out by the stated clerk in 2020. Do I have an extra copy there? Thank you. I think we should read through the entire thing. Are you speaking my voice yet, or do you mind if I read it? No one else is dying to speak up a little. Okay. Christian friends, I hope you are joining in whatever way you deem appropriate the efforts of our General Assembly in supporting racial justice across the US and around the world. Of course, the most recent visible form that has taken many of our members, that has taken for many of our members, is participation in and support for the Black Lives Matter campaign, through which we are called to acknowledge and repent of systemic racism that has shaped US culture and history for centuries. As you do so, I urge you also to join our General Assembly in returning our attention to an even older and equally egregious example of our racist past. The 222nd General Assembly, 2016, approved an overture repudiating the Doctrine of Discovery, and the 223rd General Assembly in 2018 followed with an expanded response that called for engagement by mid-councils and congregations beyond mere words of repudiation. From the earliest moment our European forebears sailed to the so-called New World, they were looking for land, for freedom, and for worldly wealth. Of course, as they approached the land masses we know as North and South America, they first landed on islands scattered throughout our oceans. There, using various forms of deception and coercion, and backed up not only by the force of weapons, but also by the power of the church and Christian theology, they proceeded to appropriate and abuse the land and peoples and expropriate valuable resources. Ironically, they justified these actions as a kind of divine right, as if God had brought them to these places and blessed their arrival. This conviction also supported them as they negotiated with the indigenous people they encountered and encroached farther and farther into this new world. Where they saw no hard borders to the land and no deeds declaring ownership by the indigenous people stating the limits of ownership of European practice. And despite strong and sustained resistance of indigenous people, European Christians used tactics of both the pen and the gun to spread out and claim the land, advancing under claims of God's providence, dispossessing and oftentimes enslaving indigenous peoples along the way. This practice, which has become a central part of policy for indigenous peoples across the world, and which undergirded the invasion across what is now the United States, is called the Doctrine of Discovery, a practice roundly condemned by our General Assembly in 2016. In our contemporary world history, this doctrine is nowhere more succinctly stated, although in a different context, than by the Israeli leader Golda Meir, as she led Jewish troops in taking over land inhabited and farmed by Palestinians for hundreds of years. Blind to that reality, she declared that Palestine was for the Jews a land with no people, for a people with no land. In a sense, that kind of rationalization was used as settlers came into what is now the United States, as if the many nations of indigenous people did not exist. American presidents supported expansion beyond the original colonies, arguing that this vast expanse of land was for the taking. Much of this was underway long before the enslavement of Black Africans became a practice. As white settlers and citizens, blessed by our US government and by their respective churches, particularly churches of the Reformed tradition, began to seek their future in the West, that movement happened in tandem with the founding of the United States of America, facilitated by US presidents like George Washington, Andrew Jackson, and Ulysses Grant. As a British officer, George Washington illegally speculated for land in Indian country, then the Ohio River Valley, in tandem with performing duties of his office. As president, he made sure that those were the duties of his office. Not long afterward, Andrew Jackson, a Presbyterian, forced what became known as the Trail of Tears. in which Cherokee, Creek, Chickasaw, Choctaw, and Seminole and other indigenous people were uprooted from their homelands and literally forced to march walk out of the southeastern United States into another farther out region designated as Indian country. The land is now called Oklahoma and surrounding territories. For white Christians, that was considered God-forsaken wilderness, a land for heathens, even though by that time many of the uprooted tribes had adopted Christianity. Many of the PCUSA's Native American congregations in the Midwestern, Western, and Southwestern parts of our country today were established as a result of manifest destiny by which white settlers moved west to land promised to them by God. Under President Grant, the peace policy included government actions to break down indigenous landholdings, community, and identity as peoples. Many Reformed Protestants had a central role in this move westward, working hand in glove with US government policies such as the Allotment Act and widespread policy of sending indigenous children to boarding schools. Under pressure from settlers and fortune hunters looking for gold in the Black Hills, California, and Alaska, the government reneged on its promises. These policies resulted in the loss of millions of acres of sovereign and sacred indigenous territory. Treaties were ignored and indigenous people's sovereignty was flouted. That disregard has continued in how the Presbyterian Church has related over the years with indigenous nations and with the indigenous congregations across the continent with whom we have historic relations and long overdue covenant obligations. One of the most egregious outcomes of all of these injustices was perhaps the effort to civilize these Indians, and in this, the church was all too complicit, participating in official government policies of assimilation, which were designed to kill the Indian, save the man. We as Presbyterians must own the part of our history that includes tearing indigenous youth out of their homes, placing them in boarding schools, forcing them to dress like our youth, requiring them to speak English only, and attempting to replace their own spirituality with our ethnocentric version of the Christian faith. Friends, this is not history long past. This trauma is perpetuated every time indigenous peoples are compelled to break with their communities and ancestral traditions in order to be in full communion with the church. The shattering of families, the uprooting and forced relocation of indigenous peoples, the persistent undermining of tribal sovereignty, and the denial of these actions as part of American history is part of our church history. As a church complicit in or supportive of these violations of their humanity and the continuing impact of our decisions on their future, we as Presbyterians have much for which to repent. It is time for all of us to repent in the ways in which we have ignored and intensified the struggles of our indigenous American siblings and neighbors. For more than half a millennium, they have tenaciously and creatively fought against genocidal programs of territorial and spiritual conquest. Their modes of resistance have been manifested in music, art, law, economics, as well as theological interventions. Recall the spiritual and territorial protests we have recently witnessed at Standing Rock. In 2018, our General Assembly called upon this church to ask probing questions of ourselves about how the doctrine of discovery has been present in our history and our theological positions and continues to be present today. This we must do in order to understand literally where we are and how we got here. Many of our mid-councils and congregations are situated within lands taken from indigenous nations. We must dig into our histories, and in doing so, we must give priority to histories of the people from whom the land was seized. And we must give deep consideration as to how our churches and communities were formed in relation and or opposition to the indigenous peoples of the region and begin ever so carefully to discern the nature of that relationship today. In doing so, we must be mindful that any dis-ease toward the church that we may perceive in the indigenous community has everything to do with the disease of white supremacy and anti-indigenous practice that is as pervasive in the church as it is in society at large. Indeed, this is about addressing the original sin of the United States of America, and it is not something we can turn away from. We are asked to confront the church's alliance with regimes of power that has caused untold suffering and oppression. We must ask how deep we are willing to go to deal with the issues of racism and repentance in this country. What we must do is act. Our General Assembly overwhelmingly approved a report in 2020 that includes an expansive but by no means exhaustive set of recommendations as to how this church may stand in solidarity with indigenous nations and peoples in their fight for sovereignty and human rights. I urge every person, congregation, presbytery, and synod in this church to read the report and recommendations of the Native American Coordinating Council, to study it and review all the resources it offers, and to begin a process of unflinching confession and material repentance that is not merely theoretical or internal, but has real, tangible expressions that truly contribute to the thriving of indigenous nations and communities. This is far more than a call to recognize Indigenous peoples in one moment or on one day. Indeed, the call to action before us is a long-term call to unsettle and decolonize a church deeply intertwined in racist settler colonial systems of white supremacy. Let us bring to the fore our commitment to true justice and stand in solidarity with all Indigenous peoples in their efforts for sovereignty and human rights. Sorry, that was so much reading.
Yeah, and it's 5 till.
That was longer than I expected to read.
You did it well.
Thank you.
Yes, you did a great job.
I think this is something that I didn't know about until I was digging. Did anybody know about it?
No.
This is our church. This is our church that has begun the process or is looking for ways to seek truth and reconciliation with Native peoples to uncover our history.
3 years ago.
3 years
Three
ago.
years ago, no, 5 years ago.
This was written in 2020.
Oh, 3 years ago.
Yeah, but the General Assembly has been putting out a report. I have 13 pages worth of recommendations of what actions the denomination and congregations are recommended to take.
From 2020.
Yes, this is from the 2020 recommendation.
Sounds like a whole ACE class theory.
I know, yeah, I can send this out. I didn't hand this out to everyone. You're welcome. But we can send this out in a PDF.
Send all the PDFs to me and I'll forward them.
Yes.
And may I, what's disturbing to me is those 3 apologies that were formal and published and all of that have a Presbyterian sign in the first 2, but not the 3rd one.
Interesting.
Yeah, and the one who signed the second was Gary Skinner,
Oh,
who was one of our entire captains who used to attend.
Yeah, I'm interested to read it and find out more. Yeah, thank you for bringing those in. So we can see that our denomination has put together a starting point, and there are many, the council that put this together was all Presbyterian pastors who had Native ancestry. So this was put together by people who bridge that divide between our church and Native communities. And I think that is one of the most important things when we're seeking truth and reconciliation is it's not just us in a room figuring out what we can do for people, but it is communities coming together. We are listening, we are hearing, and we are putting our resources into ways that they have requested. And I know we're out of time, but I had a thought and it went away. No, come back. We have to end.
thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you very much. Great class.
I remember what I wanted to say. I'm not ending yet. We're all gonna be a little bit late for church. Dory's looking at me. One of the churches that came to Yakima to do the week-long trip that we had done. I won't say what church they came from, but they were really frustrated being there because they wanted to come to teach the Native group there what they knew about faith and what they knew about God. There was a youth pastor who stayed in his room the entire time, did not speak to the leadership of the group there. And after they went to a sacred site called Shlamama, said, "You are teaching our children to pray to idols. We're leaving tonight." They left early and they wrote a couple of pages of a Facebook post to warn people against this group that is teaching their children to pray to idols. And several groups actually canceled coming because of this prominent pastor's words.
And a prominent pastor at that.
Yes, they did take it, and they overstated so many times. We are here praying to God and we are honoring the sacred site that teaches us how to be courageous. We are not praying to this. And it was sad to see how much work they had to do to overcome internally what that group had done to them and what their fears of what we might think were. So even in that, even going to a community that is a Native-led youth group that we are trying to support, that we want to listen to and learn from and work with and find what they need and like learn their culture. There are groups that are wanting to come in and be like, I can't believe that you won't listen to me teach you. We're on a mission trip. And so we are trying to foster this relationship with these folks. And I hope that you will all be here on November 5th when they will be leading church for us. And we will get to know them.
Yeah, that's.
And now you're all free to go to church. Thank you all for coming tonight.